Years after the last of the Horadrim had died, a great and prosperous society grew in the lands of the West. As time wore on, many Eastern pilgrims settled in the lands surrounding Kondaros, and soon established small, self-contained kingdoms. A few of these kingdoms bickered with Kondaros over holdings of property or routes of trade. These squabbles did little to upset the lasting peace of the West, and the great northern kingdom of Westmarch proved to be a strong ally of Kondaros, as the two lands steadily engaged in ventures of barter and commerce. During this time, a bold new religion of the light, known as Zakarum, began to spread throughout the kingdom of Westmarch and into many of its northern principalities. Zakarum, founded in the Far East, implored followers to enter into the light and forsake the darkness that lurked within their souls. The people of Westmarch adopted the statutes of Zakarum as their sacred mission in the world. Westmarch began to turn towards its neighbors, expecting them to embrace this new beginning as well. Tensions rose between the kingdoms of Westmarch and Kondaros, as the priests of Zakarum began to preach their foreign dogma, whether they were welcomed or not. It was then that the great northern lord Leoric came unto the lands of Kondaros, and in the name of Zakarum declared himself king. Leoric was a deeply religious man, and had brought many knights and priests with him that comprised his Order of the Light. Leoric and his trusted adviser, the Archbishop Lazarus, made their way to the city of Tristram. Leoric appropriated the ancient, decrepit monastery on the outskirts of town for his seat of power, and renovated it to match its time-lost glory. Although the free people of Kondaros were not pleased with being placed under the sudden rule of a foreign king, Leoric served them with justice and might. Eventually, the people of Kondaros grew to respect the kind Leoric, sensing that he sought only to guide and protect them against the oppression of darkness. Not long after Leoric took possession of Kondaros, a power, long asleep, awakened within the dark recesses beneath the monastery. Sensing that freedom was within his grasp, Diablo entered the nightmares of the Archbishop and lured him into the dark subterranean labyrinth. In his terror, Lazarus raced throughout the abandoned hallways until he at last came to the chamber of the burning soul stone. No longer in command of his body or spirit, he raised the stone above his head and uttered words long forgotten in the realm of mortals. His will destroyed, Lazarus shattered the soul stone upon the ground. Diablo once again came into the world of man. Although he was released from his imprisonment within the soul stone, the Lord of Terror was still greatly weakened from his long sleep and required an anchor to the world. Once he had found a mortal form to wear, he could begin to reclaim his vastly depleted power. The great demon weighed the souls residing in the town above, and chose to take the strongest of them, that of King Leoric. For many months King Leoric secretly fought the evil presence that twisted his thoughts and emotions. Sensing that he had been possessed by some unknown evil, Leoric hid his dark secret from his priests, hoping that somehow his own devout righteousness would be enough to exorcise the corruption growing inside him. He was sorely mistaken. Diablo stripped away the core of Leoric's being, burning away all honor and virtue from his soul. Lazarus, too, had fallen under the sway of the demon, keeping close to Leoric at all times. Lazarus worked to conceal the plans of his new master from the Order of Light, hoping that the demon's power would grow, well concealed amongst the servants of Zakarum. The priests of Zakarum and the citizenry of Kondaros recognized the disturbing change within their liege. His once proud and rugged form became distorted and deformed. King Leoric became increasingly deranged and ordered immediate executions of any who dared to question his methods or authority. Leoric began to send his knights to other villages to bully their townspeople into submission. The people of Kandaras, who had once grown to see great honor in their ruler, began to call Leoric the Black King. Driven to the brink of madness by the Lord of Terror, King Leoric slowly alienated his closest friends and advisors. Lochdonan, captain of the Knights of the Order of Light, an honored champion of Zakarum, tried to discern the nature of his king's deteriorating spirit. Yet at every turn, the Archbishop Lazarus would waylay Lochdonan and admonish him for questioning the actions of the king. As tensions grew between the two, Lazarus charged Lochdonan with treason against the kingdom. To the priests and knights of Leoric's court, the prospect of Lochdonan committing treason was ridiculous. Lochdanan's motives were honorable and just, and soon many began to question the reason of their once beloved king. Leoric's madness was growing more obvious with each passing day. Sensing that the advisors of the court were becoming increasingly suspicious of foul treachery, Lazarus desperately sought to contain the eroding situation. The Archbishop masterfully convinced the delusional Leoric that the kingdom of Westmarch was plotting against him, secretly planning to dethrone him and annex Kandaras into its own lands. Leoric flew into a rage and summoned his advisors to his side. Manipulated by the Archbishop, the paranoid king declared a state of war between the kingdoms of Kandaras and Westmarch. Leoric ignored the warnings and admonishments of his advisors, and the royal army of Kandaras was ordered to the north to engage in a war that they did not believe in. Lochdonan was appointed by Lazarus to lead the armies of Kandaras into Westmarch. Although Lochdonan argued against the necessity of the coming conflict, he was honor-bound to uphold the will of his king. Many of the high priests and officials were forced to travel to the north as emissaries on errands of diplomatic urgency as well. The desperate ploy of Lazarus had succeeded in sending many of the king's more troublesome advisors to their certain deaths. The absence of prying advisors and inquisitive priests left Diablo free to assume total control over the king's battered soul. As the Lord of Terror attempted to strengthen his hold upon the maddened king, he found that the lingering spirit of Leoric fought with him still. Although the control over Leoric that Diablo held was formidable, the demon knew that in his weakened state he could never take complete possession of his soul as long as a glimmer of his will remained. The demon lord sought a fresh and innocent host upon which to build his terror. The demon relinquished his control over Leoric, but the king's soul was left corrupted and his mind crazed. Diablo began to search throughout Kandaras for the perfect vessel to act as his focus, and found such a soul easily within his reach. Enjoined by his dark master, Lazarus kidnapped Albrecht, the only son of Leoric, and dragged the terrified youth down into the blackness of the labyrinth. Flooding the boy's defenseless mind with the essence of pure terror, Diablo easily took possession of the young Albrecht. Pain and fire raced through the child's soul. Hideous laughter filled his head and clouded his thoughts. Paralyzed with fear, Albrecht felt the presence of Diablo within his mind as it seemed to push him down, deeper and deeper into darkness and oblivion. Diablo gazed upon his surroundings through the eyes of the young prince. A lustful hunger still tortured the demon after his frustrating bout for control over Leoric, but the nightmares of the boy provided ample substance to sate him. Reaching deep into Albrecht's subconscious, Diablo ripped the greatest fears of the child from their hiding places and gave them breath. Albrecht watched, as if out of a dream. Twisted and disfigured forms appeared all around him. Unholy writhing visages of terror danced about him, chanting choruses of obscenities. All of the monsters that he had ever imagined, or believed that he had seen in his life, became flesh, and were given life before him. Large bodies, comprised of living rock, erupted from the walls and bowed to their dark master. The ancient skeletal corpses of the Horadrim arose from archaic crypts and lumbered off into the red-washed corridors beyond. As the cacophony of madness and nightmares hammered its final blow against Albrecht's shattered spirit, the bloodlusted ghouls and demons of his mind scattered and scrambled maniacally into the lengthening passageways of his waking nightmare. The ancient catacombs of the Horadrim had become a twisted labyrinth of raw, focused terror. Empowered by Diablo's possession of young Albrecht, the creatures of the boy's own imagination had gained corporeal form. So strong was the terror that grew inside of Albrecht that the borders of the mortal realm began to warp and tear. The burning hell began to seep into the world of man and take root within the labyrinth. Beings and occurrences, displaced by time and space, and long lost to the history of man, were pulled screaming into the ever-expanding domain. The body of Albrecht, fully possessed by Diablo, began to distort and change. The small boy grew, and his eyes blazed as tendril-like spines ripped through his flesh. Great arched horns erupted from Albrecht's skull, as Diablo altered the form of the child to match that of his demonic body. Deep within the recesses of the labyrinth, a growing power was being harnessed. When the moment was right, Diablo would venture once more into the mortal world and free his captive brothers, Mephisto and Baal. The primevals would be reunited, and together they would reclaim their rightful place in hell. The war against the zealous armies of Westmarch ended with a horrible slaughter. With the army of Condaras ripped to shreds by the superior numbers and defensive positions of Westmarch, Lochdannen quickly gathered together those who were not captured or killed, and ordered a retreat back to the safety of Condaras. They returned to find the town of Tristram in shambles. King Leoric, deep within the throes of madness, went into a rage when he learned that his son was missing. After scouring the village with the few guards that remained with him at the monastery, Leoric had decided that the townsfolk had abducted his son and hidden him somewhere. Although the townsfolk denied any knowledge of Prince Albrecht's whereabouts, Leoric insisted that they had crafted a conspiracy against him, and that they would pay the price for such treachery. The mysterious disappearance of the Archbishop Lazarus left no one in Tristram with whom the king would take counsel. Overcome by grief and dementia, Leoric had many of the townsfolk executed for the crime of high treason. As Lochdannen and his fellow survivors returned to confront their king, Leoric sent his few remaining guards against them. Believing that Lochdannen was somehow part of the townsfolk's conspiracy, Leoric decreed that he and his party were to die. Lochdannen, finally realizing that Leoric was beyond salvation, ordered his men to defend themselves. The ensuing battle carried them down into the very halls of the darkened monastery, bringing a final desecration to the once holy sanctum of the Horadrim. Lochdannen won a bittersweet victory, as his men were forced to kill all of Leoric's deceived protectors. They cornered the ravenous king within his own sanctuary, and begged him to explain the atrocities he had committed. Leoric only spat at them, and cursed them for traitors against both his crown and the light. Lochdannen walked slowly towards his king, and sorrowfully drew his sword. Full of grief and rage, all honor having been cast to the winds, Lochdannen ran his blade through Leoric's shriveled, blackened heart. The once noble king screamed an unearthly death cry, and as his madness finally overtook him, he brought down a curse upon those who had so betrayed him. Calling upon the forces of darkness that he had spent his entire life combating, Leoric condemned Lochdonan and the others to eternal damnation. In that last fleeting moment within the heart of the monastery, all that was ever virtuous or honorable about the stewards of Condoras was shattered forever. The Black King lay dead, slain at the hands of his own priests and knights. The young Prince Albrecht was still missing, and the proud defenders of Condoras were no more. The people of Tristram looked about their lifeless town and were greatly dismayed. Awash in feelings of both relief and remorse, they soon realized that their troubles had merely begun. Strange, eerie lights appeared in the darkened windows of the monastery. Misshapen, leathery-skinned creatures were seen venturing forth from the shadows of the church. Horrible, wounded cries seemed to linger on the wind, emanating from deep underground. It became apparent that something quite unnatural had infested the once holy site. Travelers on the road surrounding Tristram were accosted by cloaked riders that seemed to now constantly roam the deserted countryside. Many villagers fled Tristram, making their way to other towns or kingdoms, fearing some unnamed evil that seemed to wait in the shadows all around them. Those few who chose to remain seldom ventured out at night, and never tread foot upon the grounds of the cursed monastery. Whispered rumors of poor, innocent people being abducted in the night by wicked, nightmarish creatures filled the halls of the local inn. With no king, no law, and no army left to defend them, many of the townsfolk began to fear an attack from the things that now dwelt beneath their town. The Archbishop Lazarus, frayed and disheveled, returned from his absence and assured the townsfolk that he, too, had been ravaged by the growing evil of the monastery. With their desperate need for reassurance clouding their good judgment, Lazarus whipped the townspeople into a frenzied mob. Reminding them that Prince Albrecht was still unaccounted for, he persuaded many of the men to follow him into the depths of the monastery to search for the boy. They gathered torches, and soon the night air glowed with the flickering light of hope. They armed themselves with shovels, picks, and scythes, and so prepared, they boldly followed the treacherous archbishop straight into the fiery maw of hell itself. The few who survived the horrible fate that awaited them returned to Tristram and recounted what they could of the ordeal. Their wounds were terrible, and even the skills of the healer could not save some of them. As the stories of demons and devils spread, a stifling primal terror began to consume the hearts of all of the town's inhabitants. It was a terror that none of them had ever known. Deep beneath the foundations of the ruined monastery, Diablo gorged himself upon the fears of the mortals above him. He slowly sank back into the welcoming shadows and began to harness his depleted power. He smiled to himself in the sheltering darkness, for he knew that the time of his final victory was fast approaching.